Hi folks, this is Jay. I just want to talk to you a minute because there are a lot of silly, ignorant atheists out there who are very, very silly and very, very ignorant, and they need to be exposed for their ignorance. If we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, it says, "Moreover, brethren, I declare to you the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received, and in which you stand, by which also you are saved, if you hold fast the words which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you for all that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12, and after that he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain in the present, but some have fallen asleep. After that he was seen by James, then by all the apostles, then last of all he was seen by me, also as by one born of due time. For I am the least of the apostles, whom I am not worthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace towards me was not in vain. But I laboured more abundantly that they all, yet not I, but the grace of God which was with me. Therefore, whether it was I or they, so we preach, and so ye believed." Okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. We'll look at the Gospel of John. It talks about, in the Gospel of John, it says, "And he bearing," John chapter 19, "and bearing his cross he went out to a place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. There they crucified two others with him, one on either side, and Jesus in the centre. Now Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross, and the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." John chapter 20, "Now at the first day of the week Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Then she ran from and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciples whom Jesus loved, and said to them, They have taken away the Lord of the tomb out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Okay, so that's the Gospel of John. Gospel of Luke, Luke 24 verse 13. "Now behold, two men were travelling that same day to a village called Emmaus, which was 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they talked together of all these things which had happened. So it was while they covered and reasoned that Jesus, while they conversed and reasoned that Jesus himself drew near and went with them, but their eyes were restrained, so that they did not know him. And he said to them, What kind of conversation is this that you have with one another as you walk and are sad? Then one whose name was Cleopas answered and said to him, Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem, and have you not known the things which have happened were in these days? And he said to them, What things? So they said to him, The things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was the prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, beside all this, today is the third day since these things happened. Yes, and certain women of our company who arrived at the tomb early astonished us. When they did not find his body, they came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. And certain of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but him they did not see. Then he said to them, O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not the Christ to have suffered these things, and to enter into his glory? And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Then they drew near to the village where they were going, and he indicated that he would have gone farther, but they constrained him, saying, Abide with us, for it's toward evening, and the day is far spent. And he went to stay with them. Now it came to pass, as he sat at the table with them, that he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished from their sight. And they said to one another, Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked with us on the road, and while he opened the scriptures to us? and we go to Matthew. Sorry, we'll go to Mark. Mark 16, it says, "And when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary mother of James, and Salome brought spices that they might come and anoint him. Verily in the morning of the first day of the week they came to the tomb where the sun had risen. They said among themselves, Who will roll away the stone? When they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, and it was very large." And then Gospel of Matthew. "Now after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb, and behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven, came and rolled back the stone from the door, and sat on it." Okay, so we got gospel accounts of the resurrection of Christ, and we have the 1 Corinthians account, and there are other accounts in the New Testament of the resurrection of Christ. Now I just want to talk to you, first of all, the atheists come along and said, right, you can use evidence to prove the resurrection of Christ, but you can't use the Bible. And this is just stupid. I mean, this is just ignoramus at its highest. Basically, there's been a lot of scholarship recently done in ancient biography and ancient history, and if you look at the historians and Greek historians of ancient history, there was a sense that the best history for the ancient historians was eyewitness accounts. Okay? Now when people were reading the Gospels, we got to ask ourselves, what genre, how did the people who got those Gospels in those times, how did they approach those Gospels? How did they read them? And we're finding in scholarship that they actually mirror the ancient biographies and histories of ancient Rome and Greece. Okay? And the basic sort of tradition of wanting to have the best history based on eyewitness accounts. And these early Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, are written within that vein. Okay? So basically when you're reading the Gospels, you're reading as you would read it in the ancient world, and in the ancient world they would have seen it as history. Alright? So that's the first thing you need to realise. The first evidence for the resurrection of Christ is that we're not reading mythological text. We're reading something that wants to present itself as history. And that's key. So we've got to ask ourselves, is it valid history? Well, what kind of history is it? And it's interesting to know there's two types of history in modern historiography today. And that is the macro history and the micro history. And history has been done for many, many years since the 19th century with Professor Rank on the macro scale. And what that means is it's looking at history from the big people, the famous people, the rich people, the powerful people, nations and generals and kings and queens. But in the 1950s and 60s, some historians, especially in Italy, Italian historians, realised the need to write history from the micro perspective, from individual people, from those who are not that very important in history. And what do you know? That micro history is exactly reflected in the Gospels, where it's not concentrating on the generals, the kings and the queens. It's concentrating on people like Mary Magdalene and Peter, and people who are not seen as powerful, who are not seen as the bigwigs, but were people on the edge of society. So what we're seeing is actually there's a lot of, in the Gospels, there's quite a lot of sophisticated historiography going on. I'm just explaining to you, we've discovered the importance of doing micro history, and by Thompson in the 1960s and the Italian historians, and we're seeing that in the Gospels. Alright? Another example of the historicity of the Gospels is, as we look at first century Judaism, we're finding, as we study archaeology, as we're studying the times, we're discovering things from archaeology, like an inscription of the high priest Cephas and things like that, which is mentioned in the Bible. We're discovering that the Gospels are actually reflecting first century culture. So it's deeply embedded in first century Judaism, and gives you that sort of raw eyewitness kind of feel about the context, that we can actually see that the gospel writers are getting the historical times absolutely right, and it would only come from people who actually knew those times. And this is amazing stuff that we're discovering all the time. So when the atheist comes along and says you can't use the Bible, they're just being complete ignoramuses about the new development in scholarship, how it's confirming the Gospel's historicity. Alright? So now let's get to, and then on top of that we have information outside the Gospels, like Josephus, which the atheist keeps saying is not important, which it is important, like Tacitus, like Pliny. The significance of, and the Talmud, the significance of these sources are this, and this is what you've got to get key as atheists, alright? This is the key issue, right, between history and mythology, and this is the key, atheist. The reason why these sources are important, like Pliny, like Tacitus, like Josephus, and others, is what we're seeing is that there was a general and important as well. 1 Corinthians 15 is a very important historical document. Irrespective of whether the Bible's inspired, it's an extremely important historical source of information. And atheists, you're just being completely foolish, completely dishonest in not recognizing that. Historians would recognize it, but you're not recognizing it, and it's just crazy. This is 1 Corinthians 15 is written about AD 54, but it goes right back to the early times of AD 36 to 37, early source about what the early church actually believed about Jesus Christ. Here's the problem, atheist. This is the problem that you've got to get your head round. Bart Ehrman, Dr. Price, and all these top scholars, skeptical scholars like Richard Carrier. This is the problem. This is the nux. And that is this. When you put all those sources together and all that information together, the Christian faith had a general understanding of Jesus living, dying, and rising again, right at the beginning of its history. And the significance of that is it completely demolishes Bart Ehrman, it completely demolishes Dr. Price, it demolishes Richard Carrier in this. You haven't got the time for your view of development of a myth. You haven't got 20 years, 40 years, or 100 years, or 200 years for myth to develop. Right early on, there was a clear story of Jesus dying and rising again. And that is also confirmed within the Jewish context of understanding of theology and understanding Jewish culture of that time. When they understood about the resurrection, they did not understand about visions. They had a clear understanding what the resurrection was. For example, when Paul was converted, we forget that he was a Pharisee. So when we say, oh, he had an hallucination, he hallucinated. He was a Pharisee. The Pharisees believed in resurrection. He's not going to follow something that is just purely illusory. He believed in the resurrection, and he's not going to follow a Lord who didn't, unless he really rose from the dead. In other words, if you get the theology of Judaism, first century Judaism, and their understanding of resurrection in the context of the Gospels, and the first century Judaism. It also confirms this early story of Jesus dying and rising again. So that's just some background information that the atheist are total ignoramuses on, and just, just can't get. So it blows out of the water the dying and rising God mythology of Dr. Price, because we can see clearly, categorically, absolutely confirmed the early story of the life and death and resurrection of Christ. It was there, and there was no time for mythology to develop. Secondly, Richard Carrier's exegesis that he uses to bring in the Old Testament is irrelevant when we can say that we know what the early story of the Christian faith was. It's not something that developed over 50 or 100 years of mythology. This was an early story that they believed, which completely blows out of the water Carrier, because these kind of exegesis that he says the early church did would have had to develop over a long period of time as they got their act together about what they were going to teach about Jesus, and there isn't that time gap to do that. So he's nailed. Then Bart Ehrman, who would accept certain facts about Jesus, he's nailed, because even if he says there's contradictions in the text or whatever, it's irrelevant. The fact is we have early attestation of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and again there's not enough time for myth to develop, so he's completely demolished. Alright, he's completely demolished. Now you atheist, I'm listening to your videos on the resurrection of Christ, and you are just complete ignoramuses. You have not got a clue about the scholarship that is available to us at this present time on this subject. No non-stamp collector comes to me and he says to me on one of my videos, have you looked at the debate between Bart Ehrman and a historian? And I'm thinking, he just mentioned Bart Ehrman here, or a theologian. He mentioned Bart Ehrman, and I thought, the guy's an ignoramus. I mean, the guy is a complete and utter ignoramus. The guy is not in touch with cutting-edge scholarship on this subject, because Bart Ehrman is definitely not in touch with cutting edge. He's actually using an old model by Schweizer on the life of Christ, which has just been which is outmoded and is not up to date in what we're discovering about first century Judaism. So what I'm saying to you, atheist, is the background information is you just complete ignoramuses on it. I'm sorry. Even your scholars are ignorant. So basically what it comes down to is we have these basic facts, right? We have this fact that Jesus died on a cross. Dominic Crossan, an eminent scholar, the Jesus Seminar, he's not on the side of us, he's not on the side of the evangelicals, but he would say that the cross is one of the most attested facts in ancient history. So we have the cross, we have the fact that Jesus was buried in an empty tomb, by Joseph of Arimathea. We have information about that, and that is accepted and well attested as a fact. We also have attestation that Jesus, that the early church saw visions of Jesus soon after, right? Now those are the facts, right? Those are the basic facts. Now that's what we have. That's what we have. That's what we can verify. That's what we know. Now there's two ways of looking at it. We can either say, well, we don't know enough information. There could have been many other possibilities of what happened. But that doesn't explain the facts. It doesn't explain the fact how the early church, on a number of different occasions, by a number of different people, claimed to see Jesus. No psychological method, no psychological understanding of hallucination and looking at delusions or whatever can explain the multiplicity and variety of those visions that the early church had. They break down. So, and any skeptical understanding of those facts never fits all the facts. Like if you said, for example, well, Jesus didn't die on the cross. Well, it doesn't fit the fact, because we know if you get stuck on a cross with nails, you will pretty much die, and if you come off that cross, you're not going to be able to crawl away. If you say, well, the body was stolen, well, how come the church was preaching, and it was preaching in Jerusalem? Why wasn't the body brought and to shut up the church for preaching in Jerusalem? So whatever way you go at it from a skeptical point of view, it doesn't answer the facts. That's the point. The only facts that you can get into, the only way to answer it is from the context of Judeo-Christianity, that there is this God, all-powerful God, who called the Jewish people and prophesied in the scriptures that the Messiah would die and rise again. In that context, that is the only context, as Anthony Flew said, who was an atheist at the time, that would explain why Jesus had such an impact on the disciples, because when they saw those visions from a modern perspective, they were actually the resurrected Christ. And that context explains perfectly why the disciples went around preaching boldly the gospel, that Jesus died and rose again. So those are your only two ways of dealing with it, either the skeptical way or the Judeo-Christian way. Now, philosophically, you can come in and you can say, well, it couldn't have happened, miracles don't happen. But it's not that hard to critique David Hume on miracles. You see, at the end of the day, if you want to be truly open, science cannot say whether science cannot say a miracle can never happen. That's not science's job. The job of the scientist is to investigate phenomena. The problem with a miracle is you can't repeat miracles like you can repeat a scientific testable scenario. But if there is a historical event that happens of such proportions that it affects world history, then there is no reason why we can't go and investigate that information and be open to the possibility that it is a supernatural event. There is no reason why we can't do that if we examine the phenomena itself and allow that phenomena, because data is the key. As we examine that data and be open to that data, it will speak to us concerning whether or not it is true. And the point is that we go back to this macro and micro history. The gospel stories are based on micro history, the individual testimonies of the people who say they saw Jesus, and that's what it rests on. That's what it rests on. And you've got to look at the life of Peter, the life of doubting Thomas, the life of Mary Magdalene, the life of James, the brother of Jesus. You've got to look at their lives in the Gospels, and then you've got to assess whether you think their testimony is credible. And it's based on their testimony. And you have the power, the monolithic power of modernist understanding of knowledge and science pitted against the simple testimony of people who were seen as nobodies in their society, people who were seen as outcasts in their society, who testified that they saw the risen Jesus Christ. Once you accept this testimony, then the modernist paradigm is completely revolutionized in epistemology and science, because what we're saying is that science and logic and evidence and the scientific rationalism of the Enlightenment was not everything. It was not the heart of the universe. The heart of the universe was the love of God that was seen in the cross of Christ. And that has to go central alongside our logic and science. So there are two ways of looking at history, two ways of looking at knowledge, two ways of looking at humanity, two ways of looking at the problem of history. And you have a choice. I go with Thomas. I go with Peter. I go for the underdogs in the Gospels. And I believe that Jesus did rise from the dead. Thank you for listening and take care.